Hello, everyone. Welcome to MVP TechBytes. Today we have Nicholas from South Africa. Welcome, Nicholas. Can you introduce
Thank you.
yourself?
Yes, I'll do that with pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on the show. My name is Nicolas Blank. I'm an MVP in two categories in Cape Town. Well, sorry, that's not a category, that's where I live. So I live in Cape Town in South Africa, and I'm an MVP in both Microsoft Azure as well as, well, we used to call it Office 365, but the marketing people said we can't call that anymore. So it's the M365 apps and services.
Cool. Sounds good. So today, if I remember correctly, we'll be talking about security and especially zero trust. So
Yes.
what is zero trust to begin with?
So I think we all kind of have an understanding, well, we think we have an understanding of what the zero trust thing is. And actually, most of us don't understand what it isn't. So very simply speaking, zero trust is three principles. And the principles like assume breach and use least privilege access and verify explicitly. But it's not a framework. It's not a compliance thing. It's not something that you can be certified in and be compliant to, like ISO 27001 or NIST or CIS. But it is a way of doing security which takes us out of this myth of, I think I'm secure because I have a data center and I have a firewall and I've got antivirus deployed. So I should be secure. Am I secure? I don't know. I think I'm secure. So what zero trust is actually about is a way of doing IT, and actually we could apply it to many other things besides IT, that says, I choose to take an approach that the world out there and maybe even my co-workers cannot be trusted. And that's because history proves us right. But what do I do about it? And what should I do about it? And once you have those three principles in mind, the how to solve that problem actually becomes naturally evident without having to buy a product.
So it almost sounds like some kind of a guidance or something. It's almost a saying that I always hear. It's like keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, in some ways to actually make sure that you're protected. So it almost seems like zero trust, it's not like a framework, but it's more like a guidance of how to protect.
Yes. So I'll give you an example. So
Mhm.
one of the three principles of zero trust is assume breach. But what does that mean? So if I'm assuming breach, it automatically, for a prepared human being or a responsible human being, means I look for breach because I've been breached, right? If I'm assuming breach, what am I doing about it? And I prepare for breach. What happens if I get breached? Now, just doing those two things unlocks a whole raft of activities of things I should be doing that are perfectly natural. And if I apply that to myself as a person living in the country that I'm living, if I assume breach in my personal life, that means I lock my doors. I don't drive around the inner city with my car windows wound down. I don't display my valuables freely as I walk around town because I assume that someone has the intention to want to breach my person. Now, if I apply that to IT, it becomes very simple. It means I become fanatical about things like cyber hygiene, making sure that I've got standards deployed. I've got things like MFA on every identity. A lot of things just become very obvious. And then because I'm now prepared that someone wants to do something for me, I also look for indicators of breach. So I should be looking for password spray attacks on my Office 365 tenant. I should be looking for phishing attempts on my Office 365 tenant because I'm looking for the signs of breach. So what this makes very practical, if we think about it, is and we don't have to be highly theoretical about it. I can sit down as a business, no matter my size, and I think, if someone wants to breach me, how would they do it, and how do I secure against that? And that's just one of those three principles. So if we think about each one of those three principles and take it to a logical extrapolation, it becomes, how can every person and every business effectively radically raise the amount of security that they have today.
Cool. So I know that like most companies actually do provide some kind of a guidance for this zero trust. So what is the Microsoft Zero Trust Adoption Guide?
Well, that's a great question. And I was involved, I was one of the co-authors of the Zero Trust Adoption Guide. And what Microsoft did for the very first time, and this was a little bit like the moon landing, no one had actually done this. Microsoft was the first company to write down steps 1 through to 100 for a particular business scenario. How do you do zero trust? And what does it mean using Microsoft technology? So for a Microsoft customer, so let's assume we've got an E3 or an E5 or an ME3, you have something, right? But what do you do with the something that you own in order to switch the stuff on with that zero trust flavor? So if we're assuming breach, that means we deploy Defender EDR, right? But then we also look at the logs in a particular way because we're assuming breach. So least privilege access, it means I configure my intra ID tenant with a particular set of controls and I look for things. So what this adoption guide is actually all about is how do I, based on business scenarios that make sense to actual human beings, like the people who pay the money for security. And one of them, for example, is called secure, remote, and hybrid work. So how do I do that? And the article, we tell you, well, first you need to secure identity, then you need to secure an endpoint, and on and on and on. And we give that to you in actual actionable steps. So the adoption guide is how do I adopt the security very often that I own in a practical manner with steps that I can follow, as well as, so this is for the technical person, what do we do for the business person who's paying for the stuff to understand what we're doing and what are we guarding and why?
Okay. Because, yeah, like, I mean, sometimes it's technical people, it's get a hard way of translating what is valuable for a business to actually to make it into dollar values for them. Because
absolutely.
Technical people tend to look at it as technical, like a shining object or whatever it is. And business people tend to look at the thing as dollars. What is the value that I get back for spending X amount of dollars? Like speaking about dollars sort of thing, security does seems like a bottomless pit. How can it be more predictable?
It's a great question. I was talking to a CISO yesterday for one of our banking customers, and CISOs have this problem. And the problem is they have to ask for money to do a job which businesses don't understand. And it's because they're speaking the wrong language. And the business is very simple. They want to talk the language of risk. What is my risk and how do I fix it? What am I exposed to? Help me make this decision. So I'll give you an example. A CISO would go and let's assume they've got lots of certificates rolled out as an example, and they say, I need a budget line item because we need to modernize all of our X509 certificates to TLS 1.3. And the business goes, what? Oh, that's just more security mumbo jumbo. Do I actually really need that? As opposed to, hey, Mr. or Mrs. business person who's responsible for paying a thing, here's a risk that happens if we don't update the security on all of our customer-facing websites. We could get hacked. Our encryption levels drop. Our customer data could be exposed. So I need the line item that's aligned to this to negate the possible risk of reputational damage if our websites are deemed insecure by our customers. And all of a sudden we go from port 443 TLS 1. What to I have a risk. It's going to cost you so much to negate the risk. And if you don't fix the risk, this is the possible fine or outcome that you're going to have for not fixing the risk. So how we do this is we as technology people have to learn how to speak the language of risk in order to be relevant to the business people who are responsible for making the money or not spending the money.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, we need to translate the language that they understand. It's like Chinese and English almost like. I'm talking about
exactly right.
I'm talking about TLS certificate 1.1 or whatever. I need to upgrade. But like, I mean, how do I translate it into a way that would mitigate the risk of
Yes.
your reputation or something? That actually resonates with a business person more. I always see that sort of thing. So you talked about the guidance that Microsoft provides. Can I apply these guidance, the zero trust and all that, to other technologies or vendors?
Absolutely. So just because there's a Microsoft Zero Trust Adoption Framework doesn't mean that you have to use Microsoft technologies in order to do the practical things. And if we consider what is EDR, what is antivirus, what is a SIEM, right? As
Mhm.
long as we understand the particular problems that we're solving with those things and how they fit into a zero trust framework, we can swap out a competent vendor for another competent vendor. So, for example, if you are a Splunk customer with a
Mhm.
Splunk SIEM and you've got CrowdStrike deployed as XDR, another acronym,
Yeah.
and or EDR or next gen antivirus, absolutely. The disciplines will work for you. And it's kind of like when you learn how to code.
Mhm.
Originally, when we learned how to code in a language. However, we weren't restricted to that language because we learned how to code. So I grew up with Basic, moved over to Pascal, moved over to Delphi, and then moved over to other modern languages. But I knew
Mhm.
how to code. And so security is the same. Once we understand the reasons why we're doing what we're doing, and we have this framework that we can follow, and the business understands the risk that we are negating with the technologies that we're doing, we can swap technologies in and out like bricks. And
Mhm.
very often it's the literacy in the technology that decides what pieces of technology that we're going to use. So obviously, Microsoft asked us to help write this thing using the Microsoft stack. But
Mhm.
if you look at like the Microsoft cybersecurity reference architecture, Microsoft is very clear, and Mark Samos has gone on record a bunch of times publicly to say this. If you don't have an architecture, use ours. Use the technology you have in your hand. You don't have to buy our stuff. Just start somewhere and have a point of departure to become more secure.
Cool. So, I mean, I totally agree with you. Like the fact that when you learn about programming language, the basics, for loops, while loops, if statements, they apply
Yes.
to all the languages. So it's the same way that you put it very nicely. How you know the adoption framework could apply to other technologies too, because it's the same basic sort of thing. The curly bracket might be
Yes.
there's
Yes.
something different over here. It might be white
Semicolon at the end of the
spaces.
line, right? Yes.
Exactly, missing a colon or white spaces. So, I mean, it just changes a little bit, but at the same time, it's the same fundamental concepts.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned something about writing an article. How do you actually got to write for Zero Trust for Microsoft? Like, why do you get chosen? Like, what was the reason for it?
Because I am an MVP that said yes when somebody asked me for help. And it started by volunteering at Ignite. Well, actually, at
Okay.
TechEd, when TechEd was still a thing and it became Ignite. And there was a call for and the documentation team reached out to the MVP community and said, we need people who do the stuff to talk to our customers about what's in the real world. Would you talk to our customers? I was like, sure.
Mhm.
And so I started a relationship with the docs team that became the Learn team. And whenever they needed something done, I've just put my MVP hat on and said, sure, I'll help with that, because I want someone to have the benefit of what's in my head to help them with the problem that they have, which is why we're MVPs in the first place, because
Mhm.
we're really passionate about what we do and we want to tell someone using some vehicle. And that could be a podcast like this, it could be an article, or it could be helping people. Now, when I was an Exchange MVP, we used to fly to Redmond and MVP Summit, and we miss MVP summits. And we
I
used to
know.
sit with the Exchange team and they used to say, we've got this idea. What do you think? And we're like, oh, no. Oh,
Mhm.
oh yes.
Yeah.
And, and this is why I was blessed to be part of this team that I could help input into Zero Trust to guide an entire industry. And it's because I had the willingness to help someone who had a problem.
Exactly. So as an ex MVP, I do miss those Fredman days too, like where you see thousands. There's so much networking that happens over there and stuff. So, what would be your call of action for the listeners today?
I would like everyone to at least look at the adoption framework and see if there's something in there that's going to help you make your business more secure. Originally, one of the problems that we tried to solve with the adoption framework is how do we talk to business leaders, the people who spend the money, about security? And what we've tried to do in the documentation is we talk about responsibility. For example, I have a table that says the CFO, the marketing officer, and for each one of the C levels, we say this is their responsibility for security. Now, the call to action for all of us is that we live in a world where the bad people can do things for really cheap, have massive amounts of automation, and security vulnerabilities are popping up every day. So what can we do? And the first thing that we can do is we can have a level of preparation that follows a process. Here's a process. Go look at it, see what works for you, see what could work for your company, and incrementally raise the friction against attackers so they'll want to go somewhere else and not come after you. So we'll put the this particular URL in the show notes about the adoption framework overview. And if you have got the time, we spend a lot of time talking about security and two other podcasts that myself and other people are involved in. So I'll share those URLs as well.
Great. So we'll put that into the show notes. Like all the links would be down below for you guys to follow. And thank you so much, Nicolas. I learned so much about Zero Trust and how the guidance of like Zero Trust, how it helps, breaks it down into like programming languages, almost like for loops and if statements. So great. It was a great analogy, actually. Thank you so much, Nicolas. And people could follow you on your podcast. And do you have a YouTube channel too?
I don't have a personal YouTube channel. I have too much imposter syndrome for that. So I've got a cloud architects YouTube channel and podcast that I'll share, as well as a LinkedIn show that we do called SCI, that's Security, Compliance, and Identity Fridays. And I'll share that. And we love feedback. So if we're doing a great job, tell us. If there's something we can do better, please tell us. As MVPs, we want to know, right? So any kind of interaction that we can have with our audience just helps us create a better product and become better human beings.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. Great having you. Hopefully see you soon then. Bye.
Thanks, Taswar. Bye-bye.